The word was spoken between the kedgeree and the toast rack, in the pause where the footman had stepped out to fetch more hot water for the tea urn, and it landed on the breakfast table at Sefton Hall with the particular weight of something that had been carried for a long time and set down at last in the wrong place. Lady Sybil Sefton did not raise her voice when she said it. She never raised her voice. She had spent 34 years perfecting the art of delivering a wound in the same register one might use to comment on the weather, and she employed it now with the ease of long practice, her knife resting against her plate, her gaze directed not at her brother's wife, but at Sir Walter Grieve, who was seated across the table and who represented this morning an audience worth performing for. "One does wonder," she said, lifting her teacup with a hand that did not tremble, "how long the family must wait. 18 months now and nothing to show for it. But then I suppose that is the risk one takes when one selects a broodmare for temperament rather than pedigree." The silence that followed was not empty. It was architectural. A silence with walls and a ceiling, and a weight that pressed down on every surface in the room. The morning light came through the east-facing windows in long columns that caught the steam rising from the dishes on the sideboard and the dust motes suspended in the air above the table, and in that light everything was visible: the flicker of shock across Sir Walter's face, the stillness of Dorothea's hands around her teacup, the faint, satisfied settling of Sybil's shoulders as she registered the impact of what she had said and found it adequate. Dorothea Sefton, Duchess of Albemarle, did not move. She had been married to Hugh Sefton for 18 months and had lived in his house for 17 of them. And in that time, she had learned the particular architecture of Sybil's cruelty the way one learns the drafts in an old house, by feeling them, by mapping them, by understanding which doors to keep shut. The comments had begun on the first morning, when Dorothea had come down to breakfast in a dress of pale green muslin, and Sybil had looked at her with the expression of a woman inspecting a horse that had been misrepresented at auction. They had continued through the autumn and the winter and the spring, small, precise incisions delivered in the drawing room, at dinner, during calls, always in the same mild voice, always with the same careful calibration that ensured each remark could be defended as observation rather than attack. The green of the muslin did not suit her complexion. The arrangement of flowers in the morning room was not how their mother had done it. The tenants preferred to deal with someone who understood the estate's history, meaning someone who was not Dorothea. The dinner menu was ambitious for a woman who had not been raised with a French cook. The pianoforte in the drawing room had been their mother's and perhaps ought not be played by hands that had not been properly trained upon it. Dorothea had absorbed each one. She had not responded, not because she lacked words, but because she understood, with the particular intelligence of a woman who had grown up as the fourth of 5 daughters in a house where resources were scarce and observation was survival, that Sybil's power depended on the response. Each remark was a hook cast into still water. To take it was to be caught. To leave it was to let it rust and sink. But this was different. This was not a draft through a closed door. This was the door taken off its hinges. Hugh Sefton, 5th Duke of Albemarle, had been reading his correspondence. He kept the habit of bringing letters to the breakfast table, a practice his father had maintained and which Sybil had always tolerated because their father had done it, and therefore it was correct. He had been reading a letter from his steward at the northern estate, a report on drainage that required his attention but not his alarm, and he had been aware of Sybil's voice in the way that one is aware of weather, present, familiar, not requiring engagement. He heard the word. Not immediately. It arrived a half-second late, as though his mind had initially refused to process it, and then, finding no alternative, delivered it with reluctant clarity. He heard broodmare. He heard temperament rather than pedigree. He heard the precise, practiced calm of his sister's voice, deploying a word that reduced his wife to livestock in front of a guest at his own table. He set down the letter. He set down his knife. The knife made a sound against the plate, not loud, not dramatic, but distinct in the way that a small, precise sound is distinct when it occurs in a room where everyone has stopped breathing. It was the sound of a man putting something down because his hands required emptying, because what he was about to do needed hands that held nothing. Sir Walter Grieve, who had known the Sefton family for 20 years and had accepted the breakfast invitation because he was fond of Hugh, and because the ride from his own estate at Thornley was pleasant in late spring, sat with his fork suspended 2 inches above his plate. He was a man of 53 who had survived a marriage, a widowhood, and the French wars, and he recognized with the instinct of long experience that the temperature in the room had just dropped below the point where polite fiction could sustain itself. He did not look at Dorothea. He did not look at Sybil. He looked at Hugh and saw something he had never seen in his friend's face. Not anger, which would have been manageable, but the flat, still attention of a man who has just understood something about his own household that he cannot ununderstand. Sybil. One word. Her name. Spoken without heat, without volume, in the voice he used for matters that did not admit discussion. It was the voice he used in the House of Lords when a point of order had been violated, precise, final, carrying the weight of a man who understood that authority, properly exercised, did not require force. Sybil looked at him. Her expression shifted, not into alarm, not yet, but into something adjacent to it, the recognition that a familiar landscape had changed. She had heard her name spoken by her brother 10,000 times. She had never heard it spoken like this. "I beg your pardon? You will apologize to the Duchess." The instruction was not delivered as a request. It was delivered as information, a description of what would happen next, stated with the certainty of a man describing the position of the sun. Sybil's hand tightened around her teacup. The porcelain was Sèvres, part of a set their mother had brought to the house 40 years ago, and the delicacy of the cup against the force of her grip was the only visible sign that she understood the ground had moved beneath her. "Hugh, I hardly think you will apologize to the Duchess. You will do so now, and then you will leave this table." Sir Walter set his fork down with great care. He understood that he was witnessing something that did not require his participation and would not benefit from his commentary, and he gave his attention to the butter dish with the intense focus of a man attempting to become invisible through the study of dairy. Sybil looked at her brother. She looked at him with the expression she had worn since childhood, the expression that said, "I am the elder. I am the one who knows. I am the one who has always been here." It was an expression that had governed their household since their mother's death 14 years ago, when Sybil had stepped into the vacancy with the seamless authority of a woman who had been rehearsing for the role since birth. She had managed the house, she had managed the staff, she had managed the social calendar and the county relationships and the London season, and she had managed Hugh, gently, firmly, with the affectionate condescension of a sister who believed her brother needed managing and had never been given evidence to the contrary. "I spoke carelessly," Sybil said. Her voice had not changed register. She was attempting to return the conversation to the temperature at which she operated, cool, controlled, the temperature at which her authority functioned. "I did not mean—" "You meant precisely what you said. You have been meaning precisely what you say for 18 months, and I have permitted it because I did not hear it clearly until this morning. I hear it now." He paused. The pause was not for effect. It was the pause of a man choosing his next words, with the care of a man who understands that what he says next will rearrange his household permanently. "You will apologize to my wife. Then you will leave this room. After breakfast, I will have Mrs. Pendle prepare your things. You will remove to the Dower House by this evening." The Dower House. The words struck the table with more force than anything that had preceded them. The Dower House at Sefton Hall stood at the far edge of the park, a handsome stone building of 8 rooms that had been occupied by their grandmother until her death, and had stood empty since, maintained by the estate, furnished, aired quarterly by Mrs. Pendle's staff, but empty. It was the house where women of the family went when they were no longer the most important woman in the great house. Their grandmother had gone there when their mother arrived as a bride. It was the house that said, "Your time at the center is over." Sybil understood this. Her face showed it, a crack in the porcelain, hairline but visible, running from the corners of her mouth to the set of her jaw. She had lived at Sefton Hall for 34 years. She had been born in the bedchamber above the library. She had managed the household through their mother's illness, their father's death, Hugh's early years as Duke when he was 23 and uncertain, and had leaned on her for everything from menu planning to the arrangement of his first county ball. She had been, in every way that mattered except title, the Duchess of Albemarle. And now, a woman from a family she considered unremarkable, a woman whose father was a country baronet with a modest house in Hampshire, and whose accomplishments, in Sybil's private accounting, consisted primarily of being quiet and having good skin, had taken the title, and with it the position, and with it the brother who had once needed her, and now, it appeared, did not. "You cannot be serious." I have not been less serious about anything in my life. Apologize. Leave the table. The dower house will be ready by 6 o'clock. Sybil turned to Dorothea. It was the first time she had looked directly at her since delivering the remark, and what she saw, though she would not have described it this way, because to describe it accurately would have required an honesty she was not equipped for, was the thing she had been trying to destroy for 18 months, composure. Not the absence of feeling, but the governance of it. Dorothea sat with her hands still around her teacup, her posture unchanged, her expression holding the particular quality of a woman who is enduring something without the need to be seen enduring it. She had not flinched at the word. She had not wept. She had not turned to Hugh with the pleading expression of a woman who required rescue. She had simply continued to exist, in her chair, at her table, in her house, with the steady presence of a woman who understood that the most powerful response to an attempt at erasure was to remain precisely where she was. "I spoke without thinking," Sybil said. Sybil. The words were technically an apology. The tone was not. It was the tone of a woman complying with an instruction she intended to contest later, in private, where she believed her real power resided. "You will address the Duchess properly." Something moved behind Sybil's eyes, the last resistance of a woman who had governed unchallenged for so long that the experience of being corrected felt not merely unfamiliar, but structurally impossible, as though the walls of the house had shifted on their foundations. She straightened in her chair. She looked at Dorothea and said, in a voice that cost her more than anything she had ever said in her life, "I apologize, Your Grace. My words were unforgivable." Dorothea inclined her head. She did not speak. She lifted her teacup and drank. The tea was lukewarm by now, but she drank it as though it were perfect, because the act of drinking tea at one's own breakfast table while the world rearranges itself around you is not about the tea. Sybil stood. The chair scraped against the floor, the only ungoverned sound she had made all morning, and she left the room without looking back. Her footsteps receded down the corridor toward the staircase, and the house absorbed them and was still. Hugh did not watch her go. He was looking at Dorothea. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been living beside without seeing, the way one looks at a painting that has been hanging in a room for a year, and which one has walked past 1,000 times, and which, on the 1,001st time, arrests you with its clarity and makes you understand that you have been living in the presence of something remarkable and have failed, through the particular blindness of proximity, to see it. "Dorothea." "Yes?" "I'm sorry." She set down her teacup. She looked at him, not with forgiveness, which would have been premature, and not with accusation, which would have been beneath her, but with the steady, assessing gaze of a woman who has heard words and intends to wait for their meaning to be proved by action. "I know," she said. Sir Walter Grieve cleared his throat. He had been studying the butter dish for some time and had exhausted its possibilities. "Sefton," he said, with the careful lightness of a man re-entering a room after an explosion. "I believe the kedgeree has gone cold. Might I trouble you for the toast?" Hugh passed the toast rack. His hand was steady. The morning continued. The household learned of Sybil's removal before luncheon, though no formal announcement was made. Households do not require announcements. They have Mrs. Pendle, and Mrs. Pendle had ears that functioned with the precision of scientific instruments and a network of communication that would have impressed the Admiralty. By 11 o'clock, every member of staff from the kitchen maid to Aldous, the steward knew that Lady Sybil was to be installed at the Dower House by evening, and the information was received with the complicated expression that servants wear when something they have privately wished for actually occurs. A mixture of satisfaction, unease, and the fervent hope that they would not be required to carry the heavier trunks. Mrs. Pendle herself received the instruction from the Duke at 9:30 in the housekeeper's sitting room, where she kept her ledgers and her keys and the small glass of Madeira she permitted herself on Sunday evenings. She listened without expression. Mrs. Pendle's face, in professional mode, was as readable as a closed book in a locked room, and said only, "The Dower House has been aired this month, Your Grace. I shall have fires lit and the bed linen changed by 4 o'clock. "Thank you, Mrs. Pendle. Will Lady Sybil require a maid at the Dower House, or shall she bring hopwood?" "She will bring hopwood." Mrs. Pendle nodded. She did not permit herself the satisfaction that moved behind her eyes, because she was a professional, and professionals did not take visible pleasure in the redistribution of household power. But Aldous, who was passing the sitting room door and who knew Mrs. Pendle's face as well as he knew the estate accounts, saw the faintest alteration in the set of her mouth and understood. The Dower House received its mistress at 10 minutes past 6. Sybil arrived in the smaller of the two carriages. She'd requested the landau and been told by Aldous, with the impeccable courtesy of a steward following instructions, that the landau was reserved for the Duchess's use and the brougham was available. It was a small thing, the carriage. It was not a small thing at all. She brought 4 trunks, hopwood, and the portrait of their mother that had hung in her bedchamber since childhood. She did not bring the Sèvres tea set, though she had used it every morning for 14 years because the Sèvres belonged to the house and she understood, with the bitter clarity of a woman being taught the difference between residence and ownership, that she had been using it on loan. The Dower House was comfortable. It was warm. It was, by any reasonable measure, a handsome establishment that most women of rank would have been grateful to occupy. Sybil walked through its rooms with hopwood trailing behind her and felt each one as a diminishment, not of her comfort, which was adequate, but of her consequence, which was everything. Hugh came to her the following morning. Not to relent, she saw that immediately, in the way he stood in the doorway of the Dower House drawing-room with his hat in his hand and his expression carrying the particular firmness of a decision that has been slept on and confirmed. He had come to explain, not to justify. Justification implied uncertainty, but to describe clearly and without anger what would change. You are welcome at the great house for dinner when we entertain. You are welcome to use the gardens and the library. You are not welcome to comment upon my wife's conduct, her person, her family, or her management of the household. These are not requests, Sybil. They are terms. Terms, she repeated the word as though tasting it. You are offering me terms in our mother's house. It is my house. It has been my house for 11 years, and it is Dorothea's house, which you have not once acknowledged since the day she arrived in it. That ends today. Sybil was quiet for a long time. She sat in a chair that had been her grandmother's and felt the full weight of what had happened, not as injustice, not yet, but as bewilderment. She had been the center of this household. She had raised Hugh through grief and the enormous responsibility of an inherited dukedom, and she had done it without thanks, because thanks was not what she wanted. What she wanted was permanence. What she wanted was to remain essential, and the arrival of a quiet woman from Hampshire had made her inessential, and she had responded to that loss the way a drowning person responds to water, by thrashing, by grasping, by pulling down whatever was nearest. She did not say any of this. She said, "Will you take tea?" Hugh sat. They drank tea together in the Dower House drawing-room, and neither of them spoke about what had happened, and neither of them pretended it had not happened, and the silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was better. At the great house, Dorothea moved through the day with the careful attention of a woman who understood that a shift in power required management, not celebration. She met with Mrs. Pendle at 10 o'clock, their usual morning conference conducted in the housekeeper's sitting room with the household ledger open between them, and reviewed the week's menus, the linen inventory, the arrangements for the tenants' spring dinner that she had been planning since February. Mrs. Pendle watched her across the ledger. She had watched many women manage this household, the old Duchess, who had been brisk and efficient, Lady Sybil, who had been commanding in particular, and now Dorothea, who was something else entirely. Dorothea managed through attention. She remembered the names of the kitchen staff's children. She knew which footman's mother was ill and had sent broth from the house kitchen. She had noticed in her first week that the second housemaid's shoes were worn through and had arranged for new ones without being asked and without making a performance of the kindness. She managed the way water manages a landscape, not by force, but by persistence, by finding the natural channels and following them, by being present so consistently that her absence would have been felt as drought. Mrs. Pendle. Your Grace? Lady Sybil will require a hamper sent to the Dower House each week. The same provisions we send to the vicarage, bread, preserves, whatever is fresh from the kitchen garden, and a basket of cut flowers on Mondays. She is fond of the roses from the south border. Mrs. Pendle looked at her. It was the look of a woman who has just been given information she already suspected but had not confirmed, that the Duchess of Albemarle was not merely competent, but good in the old-fashioned sense of the word, in the sense that meant she would send flowers to the woman who had called her a broodmare at breakfast, because the flowers were right, and rightness was more important than satisfaction. Yes, Your Grace. The roses arrived at the dower house on Monday morning. Sybil looked at them for a long time. They were the pale ones from the south wall, the ones their grandmother had planted, the ones their mother had tended, the ones Sybil herself had claimed ownership of in the private geography of her heart. Dorothea had sent them. Dorothea, who had been in the house for 17 months and who knew which roses Sybil loved, because Dorothea noticed things, because noticing was what Dorothea did instead of performing. Sybil put the roses in water. She used a vase she found in the dower house pantry, not the crystal she would have chosen at the great house, but a simple cream-colored vessel that held the stems well enough. She set them on the windowsill where the morning light would reach them and stood looking at them for a long time, and what she felt was not gratitude, not yet, but the first distant stirring of something that might, with time and sufficient honesty, become it. The weeks passed. Hugh came to dinner at the dower house on Thursdays, a standing arrangement that emerged without discussion, the way arrangements do in families where the formal has been stripped away and only the essential remains. They spoke about the estate. They spoke about the House of Lords, where Hugh was engaged in a debate on the enclosure bill that consumed his mornings and required him to travel to London on alternate weeks. They spoke about their father, occasionally, in the careful way that siblings speak about a parent whose absence has been absorbed but not forgotten. They did not speak about Dorothea, not because Hugh forbade it, but because Sybil was not yet able to speak about her without the conversation becoming a negotiation, and Hugh had made clear that negotiation was not available. The terms were the terms. Sybil could accept them, or she could sit in the dower house and feel sorry for herself, and Hugh suspected she would do both simultaneously for some time before one won out over the other. He was right. By midsummer, Sybil had stopped sending Hopwood to the great house for reports on the household, a habit she had maintained for the first 3 weeks, with the compulsive persistence of a woman who could not stop monitoring a machine she had once operated. By August, she had begun walking in the park again, which brought her past the walled garden where Dorothea spent her mornings, and which resulted, eventually, inevitably, in a conversation. It was not a grand conversation. It was a conversation about runner beans. Dorothea was inspecting the kitchen garden with Mr. Fallow, the head gardener, and Sybil was walking past the wall when she heard Dorothea ask about the variety of runner bean that had been planted along the south-facing trellis, and Sybil, who knew because she had overseen this garden for 14 years, said from the other side of the wall without thinking, "Painted lady, grandmother planted them in the year of the old king's illness. They want more water than Fallow gives them." There was a pause. Then Dorothea's voice from the garden, carrying the warmth of a woman who is offering an opening and knows it might not be taken. "Would you show me?" Sybil came through the gate. She showed her the runner beans and the espalier pears and the strawberry bed that needed netting before the birds found it. She showed her where the asparagus crowns were planted and why the rhubarb was struggling and which corner of the herb garden received the most sun. She did this without condescension, or nearly without it. The habit was old and would take time to break, and Dorothea listened with the attentive silence of a woman who understood that this was not about runner beans. Mrs. Pendle, who observed this exchange from the kitchen window, allowed herself a small private adjustment of expression that Aldous, had he been present, would have identified as satisfaction. The autumn brought the county assembly, the first significant social occasion since the breakfast. Dorothea attended on Hugh's arm, wearing a gown of ivory silk with pearl buttons at the sleeves that Mrs. Pendle had helped her select, and which caught the candlelight in the assembly rooms with the quiet luminosity of a woman who did not require ornament because she carried her own light. Hugh stood beside her with the particular attentiveness of a man who has understood, belatedly but completely, that the woman he married is not the woman he assumed she was. She is better, she is deeper, she is the kind of woman who sends roses to her enemy and calls it housekeeping. Sir Walter Grieve was present. He crossed the room to greet them with the warm directness of a man who has survived the awkward breakfast and emerged with his friendship intact and his respect considerably increased. "Duchess," he said, bowing over Dorothea's hand, "I hear the kitchen garden is thriving." "The runner beans are especially fine this year," Dorothea said. "Lady Sybil advises more water and less sentiment, and she is right on both counts." Sir Walter looked at Hugh. Hugh looked at his wife. There was something in his expression that Sir Walter had not seen before, not pride, which implied ownership, but recognition, which implied equality. The Duke of Albemarle was looking at the Duchess of Albemarle as though she were the most interesting person in the room, and in a room full of people who had been studying the Sefton marriage for 18 months with the avid attention of spectators at a theater, this did not go unnoticed. Lady Sybil attended the assembly. She arrived separately, in the brougham, wearing a gown of dark blue silk that their mother had once worn, and she entered the rooms and saw the way the company oriented itself around Dorothea and Hugh, not around Sybil, not any longer, and felt the loss of it like a phantom limb. But she also saw Dorothea turn toward the door when she entered, say something to Hugh, and cross the room toward her with the unhurried grace of a woman approaching someone she intended to include rather than avoid. Lady Sybil, I am glad you came. Mrs. Fenton has been asking after your opinion on the altar flowers for Michaelmas. She trusts no one else's judgment, and I told her you would know exactly what was needed. It was a small thing, the altar flowers. It was not a small thing at all. It was Dorothea offering Sybil a place, not the place she had occupied before, which was gone and could not be returned, but a place nonetheless, defined not by power but by belonging, which is quieter and more durable, and which Sybil, standing in the assembly rooms in her mother's dress with the noise of the county around her, understood for the first time was what she had actually been fighting for all along. Thank you, Sybil said. The word had no edge. It was the first word she had spoken to Dorothea that contained nothing but itself. The winter came. Sybil came to the great house for Christmas dinner and sat at the table where she had once presided, and found that the meal was excellent and the conversation was better, and that Dorothea had placed her beside Hugh with Sir Walter on her other side, so that she was flanked by the two men who knew her best and who would not require her to perform. After dinner, in the drawing-room, Dorothea played the pianoforte. She played a sonata their mother had been fond of, not because she knew this, but because Mrs. Pendle had mentioned it in passing, and Dorothea had remembered, because Dorothea remembered everything, because remembering was the mechanism by which she loved. Sybil sat in the chair nearest the fire, and listened, and did not say that the pianoforte had been their mother's, and perhaps ought not be played by hands that had not been properly trained upon it. She did not say it because it was not true. It had never been true. It had been a weapon, and she had set her weapons down, not all at once and not without cost, but steadily, the way one sets down heavy things when one's arms have finally grown tired of carrying them. Hugh watched his sister and his wife from the doorway. The firelight caught them both. Sybil in the chair, Dorothea at the instrument, the music filling the room with the particular warmth that music carries when it is played in a house where it has been absent too long. He understood that what he was seeing was not reconciliation, which implied that the two women had once been allied and were returning to alliance. It was something harder and more valuable. It was construction, the building of something that had never existed between them before, assembled from the materials of rupture and tended with the patience that only women seem to possess for the work of making a household into a home. The following spring, Dorothea told him she was with child. She told him in the garden, beside the runner beans, that Sybil had taught her to water properly on a morning when the light was new and the air smelled of wet earth and the south border roses were beginning to open. Hugh took her hand and held it and did not speak for a long time, and when he did speak, he said only her name, twice, because it was the only word that contained everything he meant. The child, a girl named Frances after their mother, was born in October in the bedchamber above the library where Sybil herself had been born 35 years before. Mrs. Pendle managed the household through the confinement with the efficiency of a woman who had waited for this particular task. The way a general waits for a campaign, she knows she will win. Aldous ensured the estate ran smoothly in the Duke's distraction. Sybil came to the great house on the third day. She stood in the doorway of the bedchamber and looked at Dorothea holding the child, and felt the full, complicated weight of what she had nearly destroyed, not through malice, though it had looked like malice from the outside, but through the terror of a woman who had confused necessity with identity and had fought to preserve the former because she could not bear to examine the latter. "She has your hands," Sybil said. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, the first time she had sat on that bed since their mother had died in it, and looked at the child with an expression that contained at last nothing but what it was. "May I?" Dorothea placed Frances in Sybil's arms. The child weighed almost nothing and meant almost everything, and Sybil held her with the careful, competent hands of a woman who had managed a great house for 14 years and who understood, finally, that the most important thing she had ever held was not a household, but this. A small, warm weight that breathed and stirred and would grow up in a house where two women had learned, at great cost and by the hardest possible route, to share the same rooms without the need to own them. Hugh found them like that. Dorothea resting against the pillows, Sybil holding Frances beside the window where the October light came through in pale gold columns, Mrs. Pendle standing in the doorway with a tray of tea and the expression of a woman whose professional satisfaction had reached its absolute ceiling. He stood in the corridor and did not enter because the scene did not require him, and because the wisest thing a man can do in a house full of capable women is to know when his presence is a contribution and when it is an interruption. Years later, when Frances was old enough to ask, she would learn the story in pieces from Mrs. Pendle, who told it with the compressed efficiency of a woman who believed that important information should be communicated clearly and without embellishment. From Sir Walter, who told it with the warmth of a man who had been present at the breakfast and who believed the kedgeree had been excellent, whatever else might be said about the morning. And from Sybil herself, who told it once, on a winter evening in the Dower House, with the fire low and her hands folded, and her voice carrying the particular steadiness of a woman who has examined her worst moment with sufficient honesty to describe it without flinching. "I was afraid," Sybil told her niece, "not of your mother, of not being needed. They are different fears, but they produce the same cruelty." Frances did not fully understand this at 14. She understood it at 22 when she married and moved to her husband's house and discovered that the most difficult transition in a woman's life is not the arrival, but the accommodation. The slow daily work of finding one's place in rooms that belonged to someone else before you came, and learning to call them home anyway. Hugh, gray-haired and slower than he had been, and still reading his correspondence at the breakfast table, looked up at Dorothea each morning with the expression of a man who has learned that the most important thing he ever did was set down a knife, quietly, without drama, at the right moment, in defense of the right person. The table held. The house held. And the stories that filled it arrived as they always do, like a door left open for whoever chooses to walk through it whenever they are ready.